The diner was alive with its usual midday chaos, a symphony of clinking dishes, faint chatter, and the occasional sizzling sound from the kitchen. Marcus wiped his hands on his apron, flashing a warm smile at a family seated by the window. It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. The air carried the comforting aroma of coffee and fresh pancakes, grounding Marcus in the rhythm of his work. At just 24, he had learned to embrace the fast-paced routine, greeting regulars with practiced ease and silently reading the emotions on the faces of newcomers. Then she came in. The woman in the wheelchair entered slowly, almost hesitantly, the wheels creaking slightly as she maneuvered her way toward a quiet corner booth. Evelyn was her name, though most didn't know it. She was a regular, always sitting in the same spot by the window, gazing out as if lost in thought. Her presence was understated, yet something about her aura drew the occasional glance from curious patrons. To Marcus, she was just Miss Evelyn, a reserved but polite customer who ordered the same meal every time: scrambled eggs, dry toast, and a cup of chamomile tea. Today, however, something was different. Marcus noticed it the moment he approached her table. Evelyn seemed tense, her fingers trembling as they fiddled with a folded piece of paper. Her usually serene expression was replaced by one of unease, her eyes darting between the window and her lap. Marcus, ever observant, felt a strange pang of concern. "Good afternoon, Miss Evelyn," he said, his voice gentle as he placed the menu in front of her. "The usual today?" Evelyn looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. For a moment, she said nothing, as if searching his face for something: kindness, trust, maybe courage. Then, she gave a slight nod. "Yes, Marcus." "The usual, please," she replied softly, her voice tinged with a nervous undertone he hadn't heard before. As Marcus walked away to place her order, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just her demeanor, there was an energy about her, like she was on the verge of doing something monumental. When he returned with her tea a few minutes later, Evelyn had placed the folded paper on the table. She didn't look up as Marcus set the cup down, her fingers still gripping the edges of the paper. "Miss Evelyn, are you okay?" he asked, the words escaping him before he could stop them. She hesitated, her eyes now fixed on the paper. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. Then, as if deciding something in that very moment, she slid the folded paper across the table toward him. "For you," she said simply, her voice trembling. "For me?" Marcus frowned, picking up the paper. It wasn't just any paper, it was a newspaper clipping, aged and slightly yellowed at the edges. "You need to read it," Evelyn added, her tone firmer now. "Please." Curiosity and confusion swirled in Marcus's mind as he carefully unfolded the clipping. His eyes scanned the headline first, then froze. His breath caught in his throat as he read the first few lines. The article wasn't about a distant event or abstract scandal, it was something deeply personal, something that tied Evelyn to the very fabric of the town in ways no one could have imagined. A name jumped out at him, one he knew but couldn't immediately place. He felt the weight of Evelyn's gaze on him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the words in front of him. The more he read, the more his stomach churned. It wasn't just a story, it was a revelation. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking. He looked up at Evelyn, his expression a mix of disbelief and unspoken questions. She offered him a faint, bittersweet smile, as though she had expected his reaction. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn leaned back slightly in her wheelchair, her hands now folded in her lap. "Because you deserve to know," she said simply. "And because, sometimes, the truth has a way of finding us when we least expect it." Marcus wanted to ask more, to demand answers to the hundreds of questions now racing through his mind. But the words wouldn't come. All he could do was stare at the clipping, the weight of its contents pressing down on him like an invisible force. The diner around them continued its busy hum, oblivious to the life-changing moment unfolding in that quiet corner booth. For Marcus, the world had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. The streets of Elmwood were lined with fading memories. Decades of small-town history seemed to hang in the air, from the peeling paint on storefronts to the worn cobblestone paths that wound their way through the square. Everyone in town had a story, but only a few knew the ones that mattered most. Marcus walked home from the diner that evening with the newspaper clipping tucked carefully into his pocket, as though it were fragile and might disintegrate if handled carelessly. His thoughts swirled like a storm, each one more relentless than the last. Evelyn. Miss Evelyn. The quiet woman in the wheelchair who had slipped into the background of the town's consciousness for years. What he had read in the article was more than just a story, it was a revelation. Her name had once been on everyone's lips, her actions the center of controversy, yet now she was almost invisible. How could something so monumental be so easily forgotten? Marcus replayed the words in his mind. The clipping had been from a decades-old article, dated long before he was born. The headline alone had been enough to send a chill down his spine. Local whistleblower exposes corruption, faces backlash. Beneath it, Evelyn's younger face stared back at him, fierce and determined. She had been vibrant then, her eyes alive with purpose. The Evelyn he served scrambled eggs to every week was a shadow of that woman. When Marcus reached the small apartment he shared with his younger sister, Tasha, he immediately locked the door and sat at the kitchen table. Tasha glanced up from her schoolwork, sensing his unease. "Long day?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "You could say that," Marcus replied, distracted. Tasha went back to her notes, but Marcus couldn't focus on anything else. He unfolded the clipping again, flattening it carefully against the table. The article detailed a scandal that had rocked the town over 30 years ago. Evelyn had been a whistleblower, exposing a network of corruption that implicated prominent business leaders and even members of the local government. Contracts had been manipulated, bribes exchanged, and countless lives disrupted, all for profit. Evelyn, then a young journalist fresh out of college, had uncovered the web of deceit and reported it at great personal risk. The fallout had been catastrophic. The article described death threats, public harassment, and a near-fatal car accident that had left Evelyn paralyzed. The official story claimed the crash was an accident, but Marcus couldn't shake the suspicion that it had been retaliation for her courage. After the scandal, Evelyn had vanished from the public eye. The article ended with a haunting line, "The price of truth is often paid in silence." Marcus felt a knot tightening in his chest. He remembered stories his mother used to tell him about the old Elmwood, where money talked and justice could be bought. At the time, he had dismissed them as small-town gossip, but now they took on a chilling new context. The most unsettling part wasn't the story itself, it was the connection Evelyn seemed to have to his family. Tucked into the bottom corner of the article was a list of the victims impacted by the corruption. One name stood out, David Monroe. Marcus's father. He leaned back in his chair, the revelation hitting him like a freight train. His father had passed away when Marcus was only 12, but he had always spoken about losing his job at the factory when Marcus was just a toddler. It had plunged their family into financial chaos, forcing his mother to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. Could Evelyn have been the reason they had survived? Marcus? Tasha's voice broke through his thoughts. He looked up, startled. "You're staring at that paper like it's about to catch fire," she said, frowning. "What's going on?" Marcus hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, but he wasn't sure where to begin, or if he even should. Instead, he folded the clipping and slid it into his pocket. "Just something I need to figure out," he said, standing up. "Don't wait up. I need some air." Tasha watched him leave, concern etched on her face, but she didn't press further. Marcus found himself wandering the streets of Elmwood, the weight of the clipping burning against his leg with every step. His feet carried him almost unconsciously toward the edge of town, to the old factory where his father used to work. The building had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. It was a ghost of its former self, much like Evelyn. As he stood there, staring at the crumbling structure, memories flooded back. His father's stories of long shifts, the camaraderie among the workers, and the day it all fell apart. David Monroe had been a foreman, proud of his work and devoted to providing for his family. When the factory closed, he had been devastated. Marcus remembered the nights his father would sit silently at the kitchen table, staring at his hands as if searching for answers. Marcus clenched his fists. The system that had crushed his father and nearly destroyed Evelyn was the same one that still lingered in the shadows of Elmwood. But what could he do about it? He was just a waiter, trying to get by like everyone else. As he turned to leave, he spotted something in the distance. A light flickering in one of the factory's upper windows. He froze, his heart pounding. Who would be here now, at this hour? Curiosity, and perhaps a sense of duty, pushed him forward. He approached the building cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The front door was chained shut, but there was a gap wide enough for him to slip through. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint smell of rust. The flickering light came from a single bulb dangling from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the room. In the center of the space stood a man, his face partially obscured by the dim light. He turned when he heard Marcus's footsteps, and for a moment they stared at each other in silence. "Marcus Monroe," the man said, his voice rough but calm. "I've been expecting you." Marcus's blood ran cold. He didn't know this man, but the way he said his name sent a shiver down his spine. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The man stepped closer, revealing a weathered face marked by years of hardship. "A friend of your father's," he said. "And someone who owes Evelyn more than I can ever repay." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him once again. Whatever he thought he knew about Evelyn and his family was just the beginning. Marcus stood frozen in the dimly lit room, his pulse pounding in his ears. The man before him was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a wiry frame and deep-set eyes that seemed to hold more secrets than words could ever reveal. His face was lined, not just with age, but with the kind of wear that came from years of struggle and silence. "How do you know my father?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with suspicion, but also an undeniable curiosity. The man sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "David Monroe and I worked together at this very factory," he began, gesturing vaguely to the cavernous space around them. "He was a good man. Honest, hard-working. Too honest, in fact." The way he said "too honest" made Marcus's stomach tighten. He took a cautious step closer. "What do you mean by that?" Marcus pressed. The man chuckled bitterly, his eyes drifting to a broken conveyor belt in the corner. "Your father wasn't the type to look the other way. When the corruption started creeping in, he spoke up. Tried to warn the workers about the shady deals and missing funds. But you can guess how that went." Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat. He'd always known his father as a man of principle, but the idea that he had fought against something as insidious as corruption, and suffered for it, was a revelation. "He lost his job because of it, didn't he?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The man nodded. "Not just his job. His reputation. The higher-ups made sure of that. They painted him as a troublemaker, someone who couldn't be trusted. It wasn't long before no one in town would hire him. He fought for all of us, and we let him fall." Marcus clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Why didn't anyone stand with him? Why didn't you stand with him?" The man's gaze snapped back to Marcus, a mixture of guilt and defiance in his eyes. "You think I didn't want to? You think I didn't try? We were scared, kid. Scared of losing everything, our jobs, our families, our lives. And we weren't wrong to be." He paused, his expression darkening. "You know what they did to Evelyn. You read that article." Marcus nodded, his mind flashing back to the clipping. Evelyn had been targeted relentlessly for exposing the truth. The threats, the harassment, the crash that left her paralyzed, it was all designed to silence her and serve as a warning to anyone else who might think about speaking up. What happened to her wasn't an accident, was it? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man shook his head. "No, it wasn't. They couldn't let her story spread any further. But they underestimated her. Even after everything they did, she refused to back down. She finished the article, sent it to every major paper in the state. That woman's got more courage in her little finger than most men have in their whole damn bodies. Marcus felt a surge of admiration for Evelyn, but it was quickly overshadowed by a nagging question. Why are you telling me all this now? Why tonight? The man hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. He handed it to Marcus, his expression grave. Because she asked me to, he said. Marcus stared at the envelope, his name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. He recognized it instantly, it was Evelyn's. When? Marcus asked, his throat tightening. This morning, the man replied. She knew you'd come here tonight. Said it was time you understood the truth. Marcus opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, written in the same uneven handwriting as the envelope. The words were direct, yet brimming with emotion. Marcus. If you're reading this, it means you've already seen the article. I imagine you have questions, and I wish I could answer them all in person. But some truths are easier to put on paper. Your father was a hero. He stood up for what was right when no one else would. I owe him my life, though he never knew it. When I started investigating the corruption, he was the one who tipped me off to the missing payroll funds. Without him, I never would have uncovered the full story. He didn't just fight for his family, he fought for everyone in this town. And he paid the price for it. But his courage gave me the strength to keep going, even when it felt like the world was against me. Now, I'm asking you to find that same courage. The fight isn't over, Marcus. The people who destroyed your father and tried to destroy me are still out there, still pulling strings, still hurting others. But they're weaker now. They've grown complacent, thinking no one will stand against them. They're wrong. You can prove them wrong. This isn't just about the past, it's about the future. Your future. Tasha's future. The future of everyone in Elmwood. You have a chance to finish what your father started, to make things right in a way he never could. I believe in you. Evelyn. Marcus's hands trembled as he folded the letter, the weight of Evelyn's words pressing down on him. She was asking him to take up a mantle he hadn't even known existed until a few hours ago. How was he supposed to fight against something so big, so entrenched? You don't have to do it alone, the man said, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. There are still people in this town who care. People who've been waiting for someone like you to come along. Marcus looked at him, 1,000 emotions swirling in his chest. Fear, anger, doubt, but also a spark of determination. What do I do? He asked, his voice steady, despite the turmoil inside him. The man smiled, a glimmer of hope lighting up his tired eyes. We start by finding the others. Evelyn's not the only one with a story to tell. And when the time comes, we make sure the whole town hears it. For the first time that night, Marcus felt a sense of purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, he couldn't turn back now. Evelyn H. The days that followed were a whirlwind of discovery, doubt, and quiet determination. Marcus couldn't shake Evelyn's words from his mind, her belief in him, her plea for courage. He hadn't told Tasha yet, unsure how much to burden her with, but every step he took felt heavier, charged with the weight of a legacy he hadn't realized he'd inherited. The first step, as the old man, who finally introduced himself as Carl, had said, was to find the others. Evelyn wasn't the only one who had been affected by the corruption, she had simply been the loudest, the most visible. Others had stories, too, though fear or shame had kept them silent. Carl had been collecting these stories for years, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to bring them to light. Now, he believed Marcus was that person. Their first stop was a modest house on the outskirts of town, its paint faded and its porch sagging under the weight of time. Carl knocked firmly, and after a moment, an older woman opened the door. Her eyes widened when she saw Carl, then narrowed as they flicked to Marcus. Not here to sell anything, are you? She asked sharply. Carl shook his head. No, Lena. We're here about Evelyn and David Monroe. The mention of Marcus's father seemed to soften her, and she stepped aside to let them in. The house was small but warm, filled with the smell of baked apples and a hint of lavender. Lena gestured for them to sit at the kitchen table, then lowered herself into a chair across from them. So, she said, her tone wary but curious. What's this about? Marcus hesitated, unsure how to begin, but Carl jumped in. We're putting the pieces together, he said. The old corruption, the factory, what happened to Evelyn, and to David. Lena's face tightened at the mention of the factory. She reached for a mug of tea that sat nearby, her hands trembling slightly. David Monroe was a good man, she said quietly. Too good for this town, if you ask me. They chewed him up and spit him out, just like they did the rest of us. What do you mean? Marcus asked, leaning forward. Lena sighed. You think your dad was the only one who suffered? He was one of the first, sure, but there were plenty of us who followed. After the factory closed, my husband lost his job. We tried to make it work, but, well, things fell apart. He started drinking. The bills piled up. One night, he drove off and didn't come back. Her voice cracked, and she took a moment to collect herself. They ruined him. Ruined our family. And for what? A few extra dollars in their pockets? Marcus's heart ached at her words, but they only fueled his resolve. Did you ever think about speaking out? He asked gently. Lena gave a bitter laugh. And end up like Evelyn? No thanks. Besides, by the time I realized what was really going on, it was too late. The damage was done. Carl reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. It's not too late now, Lena, he said. We're trying to bring the truth to light, to hold those responsible accountable. But we can't do it without you. Lena looked at him, then at Marcus, her expression conflicted. And what good will it do? She asked. You think they're just going to roll over and admit what they did? No, Marcus said firmly. But they can't stop us if enough people stand up. We don't just need their admissions, we need the town to see what really happened. To understand what people like my dad and Evelyn fought for. Lena studied him for a long moment, then sighed. I don't know if you're brave or just foolish, but either way, I hope you know what you're doing. She stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a shoebox filled with papers and photographs. This is everything I have, she said, setting it on the table. It's not much, but it's the truth. Do with it what you will. Marcus opened the box carefully, his breath catching as he sifted through its contents. There were pay stubs, letters, even a few old photographs of factory workers, including his father. One letter, in particular, caught his eye. It was addressed to the factory's management and signed by several employees, including David Monroe. It was a formal complaint about missing funds, dated just weeks before the factory closed. This is incredible, Marcus said, looking up at Lena. Thank you. She nodded, her expression still guarded. Just, be careful. These people play dirty, and they don't like being exposed. Marcus promised to be cautious, though he wasn't entirely sure how. As they left Lena's house, he felt a mix of hope and dread. The evidence was mounting, but so were the risks. Over the next few days, Marcus and Carl visited more people, former factory workers, shop owners, even a retired police officer who had once tried to investigate the corruption but had been shut down by his superiors. Each person added a piece to the puzzle, and with every story, Marcus felt closer to understanding the full scope of what had happened. But it wasn't just about the past. Marcus could see how the lingering effects of the corruption still haunted the town. Businesses struggled, families carried scars that hadn't healed, and a pervasive sense of resignation hung in the air. One evening, Marcus finally shared everything with Tasha. She listened in stunned silence as he recounted what he had learned about their father, Evelyn, and the town's buried secrets. Why didn't anyone ever tell us? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because it was easier to forget," Marcus said. "But we can't forget anymore. This isn't just about Dad or Evelyn, it's about all of us. We have a chance to make things right." Tasha was quiet for a long time, then nodded. "If you're doing this, I'm with you," she said. Together, they began organizing the evidence, building a timeline of events, and compiling the stories they had gathered. Marcus reached out to a local journalist he trusted, someone he knew wouldn't be afraid to dig deep. The journalist agreed to help, promising to write an exposé that would shake the town to its core. But as they moved closer to the truth, the shadows seemed to grow darker. Marcus noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his apartment, and one night, a brick was thrown through his window. The message was clear: someone was watching, and they didn't want him to keep digging. Still, Marcus refused to back down. He thought of Evelyn, confined to her wheelchair, but unbroken. He thought of his father, who had stood up when it mattered most. And he thought of Tasha, who deserved a future free from the shadows of the past. The fight was just beginning, but for the first time, Marcus felt ready. The truth was coming, and no matter what it cost him, he knew it was worth it. The unease in Elmwood grew palpable as Marcus and Tasha intensified their efforts. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of someone stirring up the past, of truths long buried being dragged back into the light. Marcus could feel the weight of every suspicious glance, every too-long stare, from strangers at the coffee shop or the hardware store. The town was on edge, and it wasn't hard to see why. The walls of secrecy were beginning to crack, and for some, those walls were all that had kept their fragile lives together. Marcus sat at his small kitchen table late one night, poring over the files and photos they'd collected. Tasha was asleep in the next room, her exhaustion from their efforts evident. Carl had gone quiet for a few days, a necessary precaution given the attention they were drawing. The journalist, Dana, had called earlier with updates. She was making progress, but she needed one last piece of evidence to solidify the story. That missing piece consumed Marcus. He flipped through pages, his eyes scanning for anything that might connect the dots. The factory's financial records were full of discrepancies, but they were fragmented, missing key elements that tied the corruption to specific individuals. The letter signed by his father and other workers hinted at a conspiracy, but it lacked direct evidence. Then, tucked into the corner of an envelope, Marcus found a small, yellowed piece of paper. It was a receipt, dated 2 days before the factory closed. The name scrawled at the top made his heart race: Benjamin Royce. Royce had been the factory's general manager, a man known for his smooth talk and polished suits. He'd left town shortly after the factory shut down, his departure shrouded in mystery. According to Carl, Royce had been at the center of the corruption, the linchpin in a network of bribes and embezzlement that had drained the factory dry. But no one had been able to prove it. Marcus studied the receipt, his mind racing. It listed an enormous cash withdrawal from the factory's account, marked as a special allocation. The timing was suspicious, aligning perfectly with the period when funds had started disappearing. This wasn't just circumstantial, it was a smoking gun. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he drafted a plan, knowing that if this was going to work, it had to be bold. He couldn't wait for Royce to resurface or hope that someone else would connect the dots. He had to confront the man himself. The next morning, Marcus called Dana and told her what he'd found. She was skeptical at first, but quickly understood the significance of the receipt. "If you can get Royce to talk, we've got him," she said. "But Marcus, be careful. This guy doesn't play by the rules." With her help, Marcus tracked down Royce to a gated estate on the outskirts of a neighboring city. It was a stark contrast to the decaying streets of Elmwood, a testament to the wealth and comfort Royce had built on the backs of the workers he'd betrayed. Carl insisted on coming along, his grizzled determination a steadying force. "If this goes south, you'll need someone watching your back," he said. The drive to Royce's estate was tense, the silence between them punctuated only by the hum of the car engine. When they arrived, the imposing gates loomed before them, flanked by security cameras that followed their every move. Marcus pressed the intercom button, his heart pounding. I'm here to speak with Benjamin Royce, he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. There was a long pause before a voice crackled through the speaker. And who might you be? David Monroe's son. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, without warning, the gates began to creak open. Royce's home was as opulent as Marcus had imagined, marble floors, gilded mirrors, and a chandelier that seemed unnecessarily large. Royce himself met them in the foyer, his once slick hair now gray, but his air of confidence undiminished. David Monroe's son, he said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure? Marcus held up the receipt, his hand steady. I think you know why I'm here. Royce's eyes flicked to the paper, his smile faltering for just a moment before returning. Ah, yes. The past. It does have a way of catching up, doesn't it? Carl stepped forward, his voice hard. Cut the crap, Royce. We know what you did. It's time you answered for it. Royce's gaze shifted to Carl, his expression growing colder. And what, exactly, do you think you know? Marcus didn't flinch. I know my father tried to stop you. I know you bled that factory dry, and when people like Evelyn and my dad got in your way, you destroyed them. I know this receipt ties you directly to the missing funds, and I'm willing to bet there's more where it came from. Royce chuckled, though there was no humor in it. You think a piece of paper is enough to bring me down? You're more naive than I thought. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low but firm. It's not just the paper. It's the stories, the witnesses, the files we've collected. And we're not alone. There are people in Elmwood who still care about the truth, and they're ready to stand up. For the first time, Royce looked uncertain. He glanced toward a side door, as if weighing his options. You can either deny it and let this blow up in your face, Marcus continued, or you can come clean and take whatever deal might still be on the table. Either way, the truth is coming out. Royce's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might call security or worse. But then, to his surprise, the older man laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. You're your father's son, all right, Royce said. Too damn stubborn for your own good. He walked to a nearby cabinet, opened it, and pulled out a folder. Tossing it onto the table between them, he said, There. Everything you need. But don't think for a second you're doing this town a favor. People don't want the truth, they want their lives to stay comfortable, even if it's built on lies. Marcus picked up the folder, his heart racing as he flipped through its contents. Bank records, signed contracts, incriminating emails, it was all there. You'll regret this, Royce said, his voice low. Maybe, Marcus replied. But not as much as you will. He and Carl left without another word, the folder clutched tightly in Marcus's hands. As they drove back to Elmwood, the weight of what they had just done began to sink in. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had what they needed to take the next step. The truth was no longer buried. It was in their hands, ready to be unleashed. He drive back to Elmwood was heavy with anticipation. Marcus clutched the folder as if it were a lifeline, the incriminating documents inside trembling slightly in his grip. Beside him, Carl drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road but his mind clearly elsewhere. Tasha had already prepared a safe space at home for them to analyze and safeguard the evidence, but Marcus knew they were racing against the clock. Royce might have handed over the files, but that didn't mean he was out of moves. When they reached Marcus's apartment, they quickly transferred the documents to the dining table, spreading them out carefully. Tasha joined them, her expression a mix of apprehension and determination. The evidence was more damning than they'd anticipated. Royce's financial trails were unmistakable, payments funneled through shell companies, kickbacks to local officials, and large sums withdrawn under vague pretenses. There were even communications implicating other powerful figures in Elmwood who had benefited from the factory's collapse. Dana, the journalist, arrived shortly after. She was stunned by the sheer volume of the evidence. This isn't just a story, she said, her voice laced with disbelief. This is a bombshell. If we handle this right, it'll shake Elmwood to its core. But Marcus was cautious. We have to be smart about this, he said. Royce won't go down without a fight, and there are others who'll want to stop us before this gets out. We need to make sure this evidence is safe and visible. Dana nodded. I'll start drafting the article and reaching out to my contacts at larger outlets. If we can get national attention, it'll be harder for them to silence this. That night, as Dana worked on the article and Carl helped organize the documents into a coherent timeline, Marcus and Tasha took a moment to step outside for air. The cool night was a stark contrast to the heat of their efforts inside, and for a moment they stood in silence, watching the stars. Do you think this will change anything? Tasha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It has to, Marcus replied. If we don't do this, who will? We've seen what silence does, how it lets people like Royce thrive. We owe it to Dad. To Evelyn. To everyone who's been hurt by this. Tasha nodded, but the worry in her eyes lingered. Just, promise me we'll be careful. I can't lose you too. The next morning, Dana's article went live on the local paper's website. It didn't name Royce outright but hinted at corruption and cover-ups surrounding the factory's closure, promising a follow-up with hard evidence. Within hours, the story was the talk of the town. Comments flooded the website, with some readers expressing shock and outrage, while others dismissed it as sensationalism. But the real fallout came when national outlets picked up the story. The next day, a major news network aired a segment about Elmwood, framing it as a small town grappling with decades-old corruption. Marcus watched the broadcast with a mixture of pride and anxiety, knowing this would bring both attention and retaliation. The backlash began almost immediately. Anonymous threats poured in, phone calls, emails, even a note slipped under Marcus's door. Royce's legal team issued a statement denying the allegations, calling the article a baseless attack on a respected businessman. Meanwhile, whispers about Marcus's motives began to circulate, with some accusing him of seeking fame or revenge. Despite the pressure, support began to grow. Former factory workers came forward with their stories, emboldened by the article. Evelyn, though frail, gave a televised interview, recounting her own experiences with the factory and the devastating aftermath. Her words struck a chord, painting a vivid picture of the human cost of greed and corruption. In the days that followed, protests erupted in Elmwood. Dozens of residents gathered outside Royce's old office building, demanding accountability from him and others implicated in the scandal. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Elmwood" and "No More Lies" filled the streets, the collective anger of a town long silenced finally breaking through. But as the movement grew, so did the resistance. Late one night, Marcus's apartment was broken into. Files were scattered, and some documents were missing. Tasha, who had been staying with him, was shaken but unharmed. It was a stark reminder of the stakes they were facing. This isn't just about Royce anymore, Carl said grimly as they surveyed the damage. There are bigger players involved, and they're getting desperate. Determined not to be intimidated, Marcus and Dana doubled down. They released the rest of the evidence, naming not only Royce but also several local officials who had taken bribes and participated in the cover-up. The fallout was immediate. Royce was arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement, and investigations were launched into the implicated officials. The day of Royce's arraignment was surreal. Marcus stood outside the courthouse, watching as reporters swarmed the building. Evelyn was there too, sitting in her wheelchair, but exuding a quiet strength. She smiled at Marcus, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," Marcus replied. The trial that followed was long and grueling, with Royce's defense team pulling every trick in the book to discredit the evidence and the witnesses. But the truth was undeniable. As more people came forward, the depth of the corruption became impossible to ignore. Royce was ultimately convicted, and several officials resigned in disgrace. In the aftermath, Elmwood began to heal. The town's residents, inspired by the revelations, started initiatives to rebuild their community. The abandoned factory was repurposed as a community center, symbolizing a new beginning. For Marcus, the journey was transformative. He had started as a man seeking answers about his father, but had become a catalyst for change in a town that desperately needed it. As he stood in front of the community center during its grand opening, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "This is just the beginning," he said to the crowd. "The truth may be hard, but it's worth fighting for. Together, we can make sure Elmwood's best days are still ahead." The crowd erupted in applause, their faces reflecting hope and determination. For the first time in decades, Elmwood felt alive again, a town no longer defined by its past, but by its resilience and its future.